Welcome to the first lesson in Session 5 on conditional statements. A conditional statement is a statement with a hypothesis and a conclusion. More commonly, they're known as if-then statements. The hypothesis is the if section of a conditional statement, and the hypothesis has to happen in order for the conclusion to follow. The conclusion is the then section of a conditional statement, and the conclusion can't occur unless the hypothesis occurs before it. For example, if you complete this lesson, then you will understand conditional statements. The hypothesis is completing the lesson, and the conclusion is understanding conditional statements. Next example, if x to the second equals 25, then x equals 5. So the hypothesis is x squared equals 25, and the conclusion is x equals 5. Some other important terms we need to keep in mind with respect to conditional statements. The first one is the converse. The converse of a conditional statement occurs when the hypothesis and the conclusion of a conditional statement are switched. The inverse of a conditional statement is where we negate the hypothesis and the conclusion of a conditional statement. And the third one is a contrapositive. The contrapositive switches the negated hypothesis and negated conclusion of a conditional statement. So in symbols, they look like this. So in a basic conditional statement, we would say if P, then Q, where P represents the hypothesis and Q represents the conclusion. Now in a converse, P and Q are simply switched. So a converse would read if Q, then P. Now the inverse negates the hypothesis and the conclusion, so that would be if not P, then not Q. And lastly, the contrapositive negates and switches the hypothesis and the conclusion. So the contrapositive of the original conditional statement would read if not Q, then not P. Next, we're going to use the conditional statement to answer the following questions. So the statement we're going to be working with for each of the 4 questions is, if 2 angles are congruent, then they have the same measure. First thing we're going to do is identify the hypothesis and the conclusion of the conditional statement. So the hypothesis is 2 angles being congruent, and the conclusion is 2 angles having the same measure. Next, we're going to write the converse of the conditional statement. Remember, the converse just flips the hypothesis and the conclusion. So the converse of my conditional statement would be if 2 angles have the same measure, then they are congruent. Next, we have the inverse of our conditional statement. Remember, the inverse negates the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if we negate the hypothesis and the conclusion, the inverse would read, if 2 angles are not congruent, then they do not have the same measure. And lastly, we're going to express the contrapositive. And the contrapositive both flips the hypothesis and the conclusion and negates it. So if 2 angles do not have the same measure, then they will not be congruent. Now, in this example, all 4 statements are true. This will not always be the case. A counterexample is an example that disproves a conditional statement. Now, a counterexample of a conditional statement occurs when the hypothesis is met, but the conclusion does not follow. So an example, we're going to find a counterexample to the following conditional statement. If the number is prime, then it is odd. So the number 2 serves as the counterexample because it meets the hypothesis of being prime, but does not meet the conclusion of being odd. A single counterexample is all that's needed to prove a statement false. So a single counterexample can make any conditional statement as false, and you have to have the hypothesis hold true, but then the conclusion lie false. That sets a counterexample, negating the validity of an entire statement. Well, that wraps up this lesson. Please email us if you have any questions, and good luck on the quiz.